Here is an article from February of 1919 titled New York East Side called Cradle of Bolshevism. Terrorism in Russia led by aliens from America, Dr. Simons tells Senate. And this is part of the Overman Committee. So you can go find that report on, you can find it online, the PDF. And there's a link to this article. So, anyway, getting into it, it says Bolshevism as it exists in Russia was described as largely the product of the Lower East Side in New York and as a thing that would have been impossible without the support it got from that city. Today, before the Overman Committee investigating propaganda in the United States, it was testified that, in spite of assumed names of the leaders, the movement is predominantly East Side, and many intelligent Russians believe there is a great secret organization aiming at domination of the world by Bolshevik methods. It was carefully stated that the better class of Jews, and by far the greater majority of them, were not involved in this, that they opposed it and were prepared to fight. My note, I'm not so sure about that. Back to the article. The witness was the Reverend Dr. George A. Simons, who, from 1907 to October of 1918, was in Russia as head of the Methodist Episcopal Mission and the college there. He told a story based on his contact with hundreds of Russians, high and low, some met during wanderings among the poorest classes in Petrograd, in disguise after the terror was on. The Bolshevik traits summarized. Many other things to which he testified were the strong enmity toward religion of any kind which is shown by the Bolsheviks. Now, my note, that's because the Jews are anti Christian, and they were the Bolsheviks. Continuing, treatment of women in a manner to bear out many of the most shocking stories that have come out of Russia. The friendly relations between Germans and Bolsheviks, including mutual aid and the destruction of Russian industry by Bolshevik agents, apparently is furtherance of Germany's plans for industrial and commercial domination of this country. And my note is I always point out when I read this, it was not Germany, the Germans looking to dominate Russia's industrial and commercial areas. It was the Jews in Germany who were looking to do that. Much of Russia or parts of Russia, there were millions of Germans in Russia working and who were part of the industrial and commercial classes because they were good at what they did, but they weren't quote unquote dominating Russia. And they were also targeted by the Bolsheviks. So it wouldn't make any sense to think that Germany was targeting Russia's industrial and commercial areas when a lot of that was already dominated by Germans. And the Bolsheviks targeted the Germans in Russia. So that part of the story doesn't make any sense when you actually dive into it. So, anyway, continuing, plans of the Bolsheviks to propagandize the whole world, the participation of certain Americans in Bolshevik affairs, and the friendliness with them of Raymond Robbins and John Reed. Use of terrorism to maintain a small minority in power with new incidents of the horrors of the Bolshevik rule, including the starving to death of thousands. And we saw that happen in Ukraine, right? And we saw it happen in Germany after World War I and World War II, right? The Jews used the same tactics over and over again. Continuing, presence among the Bolshevik leaders and agents of many of the worst kind of criminals. Presence among them also of many people who had belonged to the proscribed classes, who are awaiting an opportunity either to escape or to overthrow Bolshevism. Activity by agents so obnoxious and cruel that there is a growing fear of a terrific pogrom which the terrorists are overthrown. Jews scorn red flag. So in the top paragraph, Dr. Simons just claims he's not anti-Jewish and that there's good Jews. In the middle paragraph, starting there, it says the Jewish agitation appeared immediately after the Kerensky Revolution, the doctor said. Now, note, Kerensky was a Jew as well. And that's another example of the I don't know what you call it, the different tiers of the revolution or the stepping stones of the revolution. They did that in the French Revolution as well. Continuing, among the speakers who opposed Kerensky's campaign for patriotism in the army, a majority were Jews. In July, before the Bolsheviks made their final bid for power, there had appeared a number from New York's Lower East Side, with many of whom he had spoken personally. They were Jews by blood, he said, but had no religion. So they were racially Jews and atheists. When the Bolshevik government was established, he went on, the majority of its officials were Jews, mostly under assumed Russian names. For instance, proof had been promised him, he said, that in the northern commune in Petrograd in December last, the Soviet contained 16 real Russians, an American Negro, Professor Gordon, so is that the name attached to the Negro? An ex-pugilist, an instructor in physical culture who had once been a doorkeeper at the American embassy and who was married to an Estonian woman, and 265 Jews from New York. Wow. Soviet leaders listed. He also read a list of officials of the Soviet government and revolutionary leaders with their assumed and real names, showing how often names hid identity. I'm not going to read them all, but you can see a few there, right? Lenin, Ulyanov, Trotsky, Bronstein, Martov, Zetterbaum. You have a Rosenfeld there, a Goldman, a Katz, Furstenberg, right? Which is interesting. Isn't that one of the Jew names, or I thought assumed Jew names from Sweden, one of the bankers, with a banker Furstenberg, but I thought that wasn't even really his name, but I could be wrong. I don't know. So anyway, moving on. Oh, note on the bottom there, the Gomberg, right? Zorian and Gomberg. And then before World War II, this is a weird side note. There was a map that was discovered or published, maybe, I don't remember, by a Jew with the last name Gomberg, showing a United States of the world and Germany divided. I should do a video on that. It's really fascinating, or Google it if you can. But he was a Jew, and here you have a Jew, Gomberg, as well, involved in the new government over the Russians. It was generally believed, Dr. Simon said, that many of the Bolshevik leaders had changed their names as an effort to make Bolshevism appear a Russian movement. He declared he did not believe it would have been possible for it to succeed without the help from New York. Yiddish used in proclamations. With the Bolsheviks in power, he said, many of their agents, among them some of the most cruel, were Jews. The country had been flooded with proclamations in Yiddish, which had not been liked by the Russians. Now, my note that the country wasn't flooded with proclamations in German, right? Because the claim was that the Bolsheviks were working with the Germans, but that's not really true. So just remember that. The country had been flooded with proclamations in Yiddish, in Jewish, which had not been liked by the Russians. Altogether, such a storm of hatred against the Jews had been brewing that hundreds had said to him, we know this is not a Russian government. It is German first. Now, again, so either he's lying or they had an error. It says it is German first and Jewish next. It's not true. It was German first and German next. I'm sorry, Jewish first and Jewish second. And they used the Germans as a veil, if you will. Very soon there is going to be a big pogrom. So widespread was the feeling, he added, that many of the people who had told him this and who happened to be Jews were sending their wives and children out of Russia. Some highly educated Russians, generals, intellectuals, and people of that class, he said, believe that there is a secret society made up of apostate Jews aiming at domination of the world by Bolshevik methods. A former businessman, a highly educated Russian, had put into book form information he had gathered about this alleged society, consisting largely of protocols in which the society claimed credit for most of the important happenings in history since the Spanish Inquisition. If these protocols reflect a real organization, the matter was serious, Dr. Simons declared, but he had found that everybody in the government to whom he had taken the matter was afraid to handle it. Dr. Simons added that he had found the same predominance of the Jewish element among the Bolsheviks in America. At the People's House in New York, a center for distribution of Bolshevik literature in Russian and English through the Rand School of Social Science, he had found 19 out of 20 people were of the same class he met in Russia. So 19 out of 20 people were Jews. Bolshevik creed atheistic. Bolshevism is not only non-religious, the doctor went on, it is anti-religious, anti-Christian, my note. It has it in mind to make all religion and religious work impossible. He said the Bolshevik orators spoke much as Emma Goldman has done on religion, and she was a Jew, and they charged the misery and suffering of the world largely to the superstitious belief that there is a God. They are already training the children in Russia in atheism, he said, and Lunarcharsky, the Commissar of Education, has prepared a catechism of atheism for use in schools. The Russian church was not exempt. Priests had been arrested, abused, and murdered. The ritual parodied and the churches profaned, he continued. He believed, on the whole, however, the Russian church had benefited, that it had been awakened and strengthened by martyrdom. Dr. Simons did not care to discuss at any length the principles of the Bolsheviki. Trotsky said, "We do not want liberty or equality. We want a dictatorship by the proletariat." That covers it, Simons said. And a dictatorship by the proletariat really means dictatorship by the Jews. That's my note. The committee tried to get some information as to the Bolshevik attitude toward women, but the doctor was embarrassed by the presence of many women at the hearing and spoke reluctantly and in very careful terms. He finally told 2 or 3 incidents of which he had knowledge. The whole Bolshevik organization was encouraging immorality, he declared. "These are the dirtiest pigs that I've ever come across," he said once. "They are so nasty that I can't put it into words." And remember, who are the Bolsheviks? Dr. Simon added to the evidence before the committee of the friendliness between the Germans and the Bolsheviks. He said the latter often denounced the Allies, seldom or never the Germans. Seek asylum in America. The Bolsheviks were less vicious in their attacks on America than on other allies, he added. This, he declared, was believed in well-informed circles in Russia to be due to their belief their game could not last long, and to their desire to have America friendly enough to offer them asylum when they should fly to escape the consequences of their crimes and the revenge of their victims. There were several Americans who were at least friendly with the Bolsheviks, Dr. Simon testified. The first he mentioned was that of Raymond Robbins of Chicago, who was in Russia in connection with the Red Cross. And my note, I think the Red Cross was actually created by Jews. I think so. They probably used that entity for subversion, and for spying. Anyway, Mr. Robbins had been a constant source of trouble during his visit, the doctor said. He had been continually held up by the Bolsheviks as a rival to Ambassador Francis. They had declared that he should be the ambassador, that he was a worker, while Francis was a capitalist. In fact, the attacks on both the ambassador and the route mission had been in connection with Robbins' name. Under the Bolshevik law, there was nothing to prevent an American citizen from sharing the Soviet government, and he had known of one American who had contemplated taking Bolshevik citizenship. He refused to state openly his opinion as to whether any American official was aiding the Bolsheviks, but promised information on this subject in executive session. The committee excluded the spectators to take up these matters late in the afternoon. Huge sums sent from Russia. Foreign propaganda was a settled policy of the Bolsheviks, the doctor said. He confirmed earlier testimony that great sums of money were being sent out of Russia to finance this propaganda. Major Humes, counsel for the committee, read into the record, a decree of the Soviet appropriating 2 million rubles for this purpose in December of 1917. In wanderings about the city, disguised as a workman, Dr. Simon said he had found an atmosphere of absolute terror. He said he had seen barge loads of people sent off to the Kronstadt prison and heard from witnesses of the murder of these people by hundreds, had known of bundles of bodies being washed ashore and seen shot down, and their bodies afterward were riddled in the street in front of his house. He had seen people drop dead in the streets from starvation, and a white-haired general begging for bread. Under the Soviet decrees, it was frankly intended to starve out the people of the non-laboring classes. As a result, thousands of these classes had fled. Thousands more had starved to death, besides the unknown number that had been murdered. Tomorrow, Mrs. Madden Summers, widow of the American consul general of Moscow, who died at his post during the horror there, will tell of her experiences. And here's a different article, also from February of 1919. It says $36 billion stolen in one Bolshevik train. My note, what does that add up to in today's, today's cost or value? That is insane if it's true. So, the article says an indication of the vast loot which the Bolsheviks got in Russia was given before the Overman Committee by Roger Smith, a National City Bank employee in Petrograd. There was no general estimate possible, he said, but a single train, so just one train, taking the loot from the state bank up to Nizhny Novgorod for safety, was valued, according to inside reports, at 72 billion rubles, or $36 billion, or more than the entire cost of the war to America to date. That is insane. So obviously the Bolsheviks had, if this is true, Bolsheviks had plenty of money to spread Bolshevism around the world because remember, it was a worldwide revolution by the Jews. Then in the middle there, it says, Simon's inaccurate about Bolsheviks, says New Yorkers. So this is all from the same New York Tribune Saturday, February 15th paper. And it says, Trotsky not fair representative of East Side. Lenin, Russian Prince, real leader, says Jews. So it says Simon's inaccurate about Bolsheviks, says New Yorkers. It wasn't New Yorkers, it was Jews living in New York who got angry that Simons had said that Jews in the Lower East Side were the cause of the revolution. And so they were complaining that, oh no, we've been had, that's not true. And so on the right there, the article says, inaccurate, unreliable, unfair were the words of Louis Marshall, a Jew, applied to the clergyman's testimony. Contemptible was the adjective Rabbi Joseph Silverman used. At the Rand School, so we have the Rand School mentioned again. At the Rand School of Social Science, Dr. Simon's point of view was spoken of as un-American. Un-American. A Jew says un-American. Maybe it was un-Jewish, but it most certainly was not un-American. Hilarious. And then on the bottom there it says, to attempt to identify the Bolshevik movement with the Jewish race is simply preposterous, said Felix M. Warburg. Felix Warburg. Unbelievable. They are all liars and deceivers.